Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. Hello and welcome to the prestigious Golden Pig Awards of Strixhaven. Throughout spoiler season, commanders have been competing for this fabulous award. And although there are many worthy commanders, only one will stand above the rest and claim the title of the Golden Pig of Strixhaven. The winner of this most coveted award will receive the Golden Pig statue. Amazon has simply outdone themselves with the fine craftsmanship of this pure gold pig. This priceless award will be cherished forever by the Golden Pig of Strixhaven. Just a quick note before we jump into the runners-up. Commanders from both Strixhaven as well as the Strixhaven Commander Precons are considered for this award. And of course, these picks for the Golden Pig Awards are picked completely based off of my own opinions. I'm selecting my favorite commanders from this set based off of their design, and your picks might be different, and that's okay. So because this is based off of my favorites, it is not determining what the most powerful commanders of Strixhaven are. If you're looking for that contest, well, sorry. There currently isn't an award for that. But with all that said, let's jump into it. So coming in 10th place, we've got Hofry Ghostforge. Hofry is a 4/5 dwarf cleric that costs 3 red-white. He has Spirit you control get +1/+1 and have Trample and Haste. And whenever another non-token creature you control dies, exile it. If you do, create a token that's a copy of that creature, except it's a spirit in addition to its other types, and it has, when this creature leaves the battlefield, return the exile card to your graveyard. Hofry is a value engine in Boros. He essentially gives you a replacement of a creature when it dies. And because that creature token replacement is a spirit, it's going to be even more powerful since it gets +1/+1, Trample, and Haste. And then when that spirit token goes away, you get the other one back in your graveyard. There are a ton of powerful things that you can do with this commander. First off, you can get an absurd amount of value out of creatures with ETBs and LTBs. For example, Sun Titan has when it enters the battlefield or attacks, you may return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So we get that trigger when Sun Titan enters the battlefield and when it attacks, and then with our commander, when it dies, we get a token copy of it. So we're getting that ETB again, and then its attack trigger again as well when we attack. So Sun Titan can get us even more things back out of our graveyard. And then Molten Primordial says when it enters the battlefield, for each opponent, gain control of up to 1 target creature that player controls until end of turn. Untap those creatures that gain haste until end of turn. So being able to threaten 3 creatures on each ETB is an incredibly powerful thing. And speaking of powerful, there's Chancellor of the Forge, which has, when it enters the battlefield, put X/1/1 red goblin creature tokens with haste onto the battlefield, where X is the number of creatures you control. So essentially, when this comes into play, it doubles up the number of creatures that we have. And then thanks to Hofry, when it dies, it doubles our creatures again. That is an absurd amount of tokens, and if we can keep getting this back over and over again, it can get even more absurd. Of course, with this commander, we're going to want some effective free sacrifice outlets like Thermopod. It says sacrifice a creature, add red to your mana pool. So essentially, whenever we want to, we can sacrifice one of our non-token creatures with a powerful ETB or LTB and essentially get that right away. Again, Hofry's going to make a copy of it, and we get a ton of value on top of the value that we get from actually sacrificing the creature with Thermopod. So we can make a ton of mana, cast more things, sacrifice them, and you see where this is going. And of course, we can heavily utilize a card like Warstorm Surge. It says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, deals damage equal to its power to any target. So we have our creature come into play, we ping something, we sacrifice that creature, and we get a bigger copy of it because of our commander's Anthem effect, and we ping something again. This can dish out an absurd amount of damage throughout the game. And for a really big and explosive turn, we can utilize something like Face Reward. It says return to the battlefield all permanent cards in your graveyard that were put there from the battlefield this turn. So we essentially sacrifice our creatures, we get token copies of them, we sacrifice those, then we cast this, and we get all of our creatures back to do it all over again. That is a ton of value in one turn. Again, I really like the design of Hofry. It's a Boros commander that helps us get value in a different and unique way. It can do some incredibly powerful things and can have some really explosive turns. And speaking of incredibly powerful, let's move on to number 9 with Varan, Voice of Duality. It's a 2/2 Efreet Wizard for 1 blue-red. It has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. And if you casting or copying an instant or sorcery spell causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So we've seen somewhat similar commanders to this one that double up triggers. For example, Yarok doubles up ETBs, kind of like a Panharmonicon commander. And then Teysa Karlov doubles up death triggers like a Death Harmonicon commander. So Varan is kind of like a Spell Harmonicon commander. And yes, I know that there are more spells outside of instants and sorceries, but instants and sorceries are pretty much the most spelly card, okay? Doubling up your triggers from casting instants and sorceries is an incredibly powerful thing though. And of course this doubles up Varan's trigger, but there are a lot more powerful things that you can do with this. For example, let's take a look at some cards with some triggers like Young Pyromancer, Niv-Mizzet Parent, and Swarm Intelligence. Young Pyromancer says, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create a 1/1 red elemental creature token. So now with Varan in play, every single time we cast an instant or sorcery spell, we're getting 2 creature tokens. With a Spellslinger deck like this one, we're going to be casting a ton of spells in a turn, and we can flood the board in no time. And then Niv-Mizzet Parent does a lot of things, but first up, let's just read that last part, which says, whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell, you draw a card. So with this in play, when anyone casts an instant or sorcery spell, including our opponents, we're going to be drawing a card. But with our commander in play, now whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, we're drawing 2 cards. So now essentially, every single one of our instants and sorceries is a double cantrip. And then we're also going to be running a ton of cantrips, so yeah, cast a spell, draw 3 is pretty crazy. Especially since Niv-Mizzet Parent also says whenever you draw a card, Niv-Mizzet Parent deals 1 damage to any target. So this can ping down a ton of our opponent's creatures, or just ping down our opponents by hitting them in the face. And then Swarm Intelligence is a fantastic card in this deck as well. It says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you may copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. Again, that's going to trigger twice thanks to our commander's doubling effect. So yeah, that's an incredibly powerful thing, getting 2 additional copies of every single one of our instants and sorceries. I mean, even a card like Aria Flame can be effective with this commander. It says when it enters the battlefield, each opponent gains 10 life, so yeah, that's not a good thing. You're essentially just dishing out 30 life in total. But it also says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, put a burst counter on Aria Flame, then it deals damage equal to the number of burst counters on it to target player or planeswalker. So now whenever we're casting an instant or sorcery spell, we're getting that trigger twice. So that's twice the burst counters and twice the amount of pings. And again, with the number of instants and sorceries that we can cast, we're going to be making up that damage really quickly. And of course, we got a lot of fantastic Magecraft triggers in this set, like Archmage Emeritus and Stormkiln Artist. Archmage Emeritus says Magecraft, whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, draw a card. So unlike other effects like Niv-Mizzet Parent, this one also counts copied spells. Yeah, this can draw us an absurd amount of cards in a game. And speaking of an absurd effect, there's Stormkiln Artist. It has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, create a treasure token. So now, essentially, every single time we cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, we gain 2 mana. And again, in this kind of a deck, we're going to have plenty of low-to-the-ground spells that just cost 1 mana, so we're essentially netting mana whenever we're casting any of those spells. So again, Varan allows you to have a really powerful spell-slinging build that lets you utilize a ton of great and exciting cards. Now, is she going to be as popular as the other Harmonicon commanders like Teysa or Yarok? I'm not sure. Truly, only time will tell on that. But next up, let's move on to number 8 with Octavia, Living Thesis. And actually, I promise that this wasn't intentional, but I actually just realized this while I was recording, but putting this one at number 8 is incredibly ironic. Because Octavia is an octopus with 8 arms that cares about a lot of 8 things. It's an 8/8 elemental octopus for 8 blue. This spell costs 8 less to cast if you have 8 or more instant and or sorcery cards in your graveyard. It has Ward 8, which is basically a lesser version of Hexproof, but 8 is a ton of mana to pay, so your opponents probably won't be able to target this. And then it's got Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, target creature has base power and toughness 8/8 until end of turn. So there's a lot going on here and a ton of flavor as well. Regardless, this is an 8/8 that protects itself that you can cast for just 2 mana, and on top of that, it can make your creatures huge. Now, obviously you need some setup to just cast this commander for blue, but getting some instants and sorceries into your graveyard should not be that big of a deal. So with this kind of a deck, I would probably try to run a good amount of low-to-the-ground instants and sorceries that mill myself. For example, Thought Scour says target player mills 2 cards, draw a card. So I have to say cantrip that mills us, which is pretty fantastic for this kind of a deck. I mean, in total, including this card, we can get up to 3 instants and sorceries in our graveyard for just 1 mana. And then how about Dream Twist, an instant for a blue that says target player puts the top 3 cards of their library into their graveyard and it's got flashback for 1 in a blue. So we can do this twice, hopefully hitting more instants and sorceries. We can also utilize an enchantment like Drowned Secrets that says whenever you cast a blue spell, target player puts the top 2 cards of their library into our graveyard. So this essentially makes all of our blue spells come with Mill Yourself too. If we get this down early, we can easily get to that requirement very quickly. And again, once our commander's in play, we can actually utilize those instants and sorceries to make creatures huge. So we're going to want a lot of creatures on the board with things like Rise from the Tides, Tolerant Sky Summoner, and Docent of Perfection. Rise from the Tides is a sorcery for 5 and a blue and says create a tap 2/2 black zombie creature token for each instant sorcery card in your graveyard. Again, with the amount that we're going to be milling ourselves and the number of instants and sorceries we're going to get in our graveyard, this can produce us a ton of creatures. And then next turn we can swing with our zombie army, and then whichever ones get through, we cast a few instants to dish out a ton of damage by making them into 8/8s. And speaking of dishing out a ton of damage with a huge army, there's Tolerant Sky Summoner. It says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create a 2/2 blue Drake creature token with flying. So these creatures already have evasion, so making them into 8/8s can be incredibly deadly. And speaking of deadly, there's Docent of Perfection, which says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, put a 1/1 blue human wizard creature token onto the battlefield. Then if you control 3 or more wizards, transform Docent of Perfection. It transforms into Final Iteration, which says wizards you control get +2/+1 and have flying. And whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, put a 1/1 blue human wizard creature token onto the battlefield. So yeah, flipping this is going to be incredibly easy for us to do with a deck like this. And then when we do that, all of our wizards get a buff and have flying. So just by casting an instant or sorcery spell, we can turn one of those 1/1s into an 8/8, and it's still getting +2/+1 in flying. So yeah, a 10/1 with flying is pretty deadly, especially when we can make multiple of them. So yeah, Octavia is an incredibly flavorful and unique commander. You can really utilize spell slinging, mill, and token creation to make this deck really hum. But next up, let's move on to number 7 with Killian Inc. Duelist. Killian is a 2/2 human warlock with lifelink and menace that costs white-black. Killian says spells you cast that target a creature cost 2 less to cast. So this is an Orzhov, or should I say Silver Quill commander, that wants you to focus on casting spells that target creatures. This creature takes Orzhov in a completely different direction than it really ever goes. Cost reduction for casting spells really isn't something that you see in Orzhov. So with this commander, you can utilize a lot of otherwise seen as unusable cards in Commander. Saving 2 mana per spell is a huge deal, and it lets you cast a ton of spells in a single turn. So some spells that this can make a lot more efficient and therefore more effective are cards like Dark Dabbling, Grisly Transformation, and Sage's Reverie. Dark Dabbling is an instant for 2 and a black, but again with our commander, since we're targeting a creature with this, it's just going to cost us a black. It says regenerate target creature, draw a card, spell mastery. If there are 2 or more instant and or sorcery cards in your graveyard, also regenerate each other creature you control. Getting spell mastery is going to be really easy in a deck like this. So again, with Killian, this is essentially a 1 mana regenerate your entire team spell that is also a cantrip. And I think leaning heavily into cantrip effects can be very effective with this commander to allow you to chain spell after spell after spell. So even a card like Grisly Transformation, which basically sees no play in Commander, can be very effective in a deck like this. It's an aura that says enchant creature when it enters the battlefield, draw a card, enchanted creature has Intimidate. So with this, you can make a creature really hard to block or even impossible to block in certain scenarios. Focusing on auras and building up a certain creature can be very impactful in this kind of a deck. And something like Sage's Reverie can really take this to another level. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card for each aura you control that's attached to a creature, and enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each aura you control that's attached to a creature. Basically, again, with Killian in play, this is a 2 mana, draw a ton of cards spell, and also pump that creature a lot as well. And you can also generate even more card advantage with a card like Furia. Furia, Judge of Valor, is a 2/4 Angel Cleric with flying and lifelink, and it has whenever you cast your second spell each turn, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 1 of them in your hand, and the rest in your graveyard. With all your mana reduction with this kind of a commander, you're easily going to be able to cast 2 spells in a turn. And keep in mind that this says each turn, so if you've got some instants that you can cast on your opponent's turns, you can get even more value out of this. But speaking of value, there's Core Spirit Dancer, which gets +2/+2 for each aura attached to it, and whenever you cast an aura spell, you may draw a card. So this is a fantastic target for all of our auras, making it gigantic and also drawing us a ton of cards at the same time. And another great target that this commander can really utilize is something like Agent of the Fates. It has Heroic. Whenever you cast a spell that targets Agent of the Fates, each opponent sacrifices a creature. Targeting this multiple times in a turn is incredibly easy for this kind of a deck. So this can quickly wipe out all of your opponent's creatures and nearly make it impossible for them to keep anything on the board. And of course, there are plenty of other heroic creatures that work fantastically with this commander. Overall, I really like the different and unique direction that Killian takes for an Orzhov commander. Again, spell slinging targeting Orzhov with heroic really isn't something that you normally would see. But now it's time for us to move on to number 6 with Ruxa Patient Professor, or as I like to call it, Teddy Ruxa Spin. Ruxa is a 4/4 bear druid for 2 green. Whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, return target creature card with no abilities from your graveyard to your hand. Creatures you control with no abilities get +1/+1, and you may have creatures you control with no abilities assign their combat damage as though they weren't blocked. So in Magic, a creature with no abilities is known as a vanilla creature. Basically, it just has power and toughness, and nothing else, maybe flavor text, but that doesn't really matter. And in a format like Commander, those vanilla creatures are rarely utilized, if ever utilized at all. But this commander takes those vanilla creatures and says, hey, you can be great as well. I'm gonna get you back if you're taken out, I'm gonna pump you, and I'm also gonna help you get a ton of damage through. Now, vanilla creature tribal is something that I never anticipated out of a commander, but I'm really excited to see it now. Now, with Ruxa, you want to utilize other pump effects like Muragonda Petroglyphs, Gaia's Anthem, and Vitalizing Wind. Muragonda Petroglyph says creatures with no abilities get +2/+2. So now, in combination with your commander, your creatures are getting +3/+3. And then Gaia's Anthem, like the name states, is obviously another anthem, and this one gives your creatures +1/+1. Again, any kind of incremental gains can be huge for a deck like this. Or a big one-shot effect like Vitalizing Wind can be game-ending. It says creatures you control get +7/+7 until end of turn. Now, usually this card not giving trample is a huge downside, but for Ruxa, that's a big upside. Again, because this keeps our creatures vanilla and Ruxa allows us to get damage through when our creatures are vanilla, this can let us get a ton of damage through all at once. If you are building a deck around Ruxa, please keep one thing in mind. Do not utilize anthem effects and pump effects that make your creatures not vanilla. What I mean by that is if you utilize a pump effect like Overrun, which gives your creatures +3/+3 and trample, it's going to be actively hurting your creatures. Because your creatures now have trample until end of turn, they lose their benefits from Ruxa. So that means no more +1/+1 from Ruxa, and also their combat damage can't just go through when they're blocked. So again, please be careful. Now, when it comes to vanilla creatures, you can really utilize some hyper-efficient ones like Gigantosaurus. It's a 10/10 for just 5 mana. So yeah, with our commander, we can get a lot of damage through with this. And of course, with this commander, we can really utilize some vanilla creature tokens as well. Deep Forest Hermit has Vanishing 3. When it enters the battlefield, create 4 1/1 green scroll creature tokens, and scrolls you control get +1/+1. So for just 5 mana, we're getting 4 1/1 scrolls that get pumped to 2 2s, and then with Ruxa, we're pumping them again, so another 3 3s. And of course, we can just get their combat damage through, so yeah, 12 scroll power is pretty good for just 5 mana. And speaking of powerful, there's Howl the Night Pack, which says put a 2/2 green wolf creature token onto the battlefield for each force you control. Even with just 7 force in play to cast this spell, that's going to be 21 total power, and again, we can have that damage just go through. Ruxa gives your vanilla creatures and vanilla effects a home, and that is a fantastic thing for a commander. I really love when commanders help you utilize otherwise unusable cards in Commander. But now it's time for us to move on to number 5 with Ryonya, Fire Dancer. Ryonya is a 3/4 human wizard for 3 red. She has at the beginning of combat on your turn, create X tokens that are copies of another target creature you control, where X is 1 plus the number of instant and sorcery spells you've cast this turn. They gain haste, exile them at the beginning of the next end step. So this commander wants you to spell sling to make a ton of copies of one creature. So you can do some crazy powerful and effective things with this. In mono red, you've got access to a lot of low to the ground spells. So you can utilize some cantrip effects as well as some ritual effects to get a lot of spells cast in a turn. And then you go to combat and you copy something for an incredible amount of value. Just to mention a few targets, how about Emrakul's Hatcher, Spawn of Thraxes, and Inferno Titan. Emrakul's Hatcher has, when it enters the battlefield, put 3/0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature tokens onto the battlefield they have, sacrifice this creature, add 1 to your mana pool. Again, say that we make 5 copies of this, that's going to be an incredible amount of value. That's 15 extra Eldrazi spawn that we can sacrifice whenever we want for mana. Or how about Spawn of Thraxes, which says when it enters the battlefield, it deals damage to target creature or player equal to the number of mountains you control. Yeah, 5 copies of that is game ending for one or multiple opponents. And then Inferno Titan helps us out in multiple ways. It says when it enters the battlefield or attacks, it deals 3 damage divided as you choose among 1, 2, or 3 targets. So again, because our commander gives those tokens haste, we're getting the attack triggers as well as the ETB triggers. So that's an absurd amount of damage that we're dishing out, which we can split up however we want to among any targets. And speaking of attack triggers, let's talk about Lightning Runner, Hell Rider, and Bane of Balaget. Lightning Runner says when it attacks you get 2 energy counters, then you may pay 8 energy. If you pay, untap all creatures you control, and after this phase, there's no combat phase. So yeah, just a couple of token copies of this and we've got infinite combats. And then Hell Rider might just be my favorite. It says whenever a creature you control attacks, Hell Rider deals 1 damage to the player or planeswalker it's attacking. So getting multiple copies of this and then swinging out with a lot of creatures is absurd. With 5 copies of this in play, essentially we're dishing out 6 extra damage per creature that's attacking a player. Or we could just utilize an Eldrazi like Bane of Balaget. It says when it attacks, defending player exiles 2 permanents they control. So with this effect or with Annihilator effects, we can get rid of our opponent's things really quickly with multiple copies. To me, Ryonya is a new take on a Brutaclad type commander, and I really like the way it turned out. You cast a ton of instants and sorceries, you copy something really powerful a lot of times, and you have fun from there. But now let's move on to number 4 with Dina, Soul Steeper. This one actually I think is a pretty underrated commander, as I haven't seen a lot of talk about it yet. Dina is a 1/3 Dryad Druid for black-green. Dina has whenever you gain life, each opponent loses 1 life. And by paying 1 and sacrificing another creature, Dina Soul Steeper gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is the sacrificed creature's power. So Dina is a commander in Golgari colors that cares about you gaining life and punishes your opponents when you do so. Now, yes, I know that a somewhat similar commander to this one exists, like Veto. But in my opinion, Veto actually works very differently and is going to utilize an entirely different subset of cards. So instead of just utilizing some massive life gain effects, Dina can be very effective at utilizing repeatable, smaller effects. And in Commander, a lot of these life gain cards that can work perfectly with Dina might be seen as weak or useless otherwise. And turning your life gain into life drain is a very impactful thing. So Dina can really utilize cards like Sun Droplet, Essence Warden, and Death Greeter. Sun Droplet says whenever you're dealt damage, put that many charge counters on Sun Droplet. At the beginning of each upkeep, you remove a charge counter from Sun Droplet. If you do, you gain 1 life. So once you get hit a few times to get some counters on this can do a ton of work for you. Essentially, with each trip around the table, if you've got enough counters on this, you're going to be gaining 4 life and draining each opponent for 4. That's a ton of value, so this can actually be a good deterrent for just even having this in play. But your opponents won't be able to stop you from gaining life in other ways like Essence Warden and Death Greeter, which are essentially 2 sides of the same coin. Essence Warden says whenever another creature enters the battlefield, you gain 1 life. Keep in mind that this counts everyone's creatures, including your opponents. So for each creature that comes into play under your opponent's control, they're essentially having to pay 1 life to do so. And then Death Greeter essentially gets them on the way out as well, because it says whenever their creature dies, you may gain 1 life. So we can punish players for playing creatures and creatures dying, and that includes ours as well. And speaking of creatures dying, of course this kind of a deck can really utilize some Blood Artist type effects, like Blood Artist. It says whenever it or another creature dies, target player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So with our commander in play, we can drain all opponents even faster, especially since our commander is a sacrifice outlet as well. Even a card like Life Gift can be fantastic in this deck. It says whenever a land comes into play, you may gain 1 life. This counts anyone's lands coming into play. So whenever a player plays a land or land ramps, we're going to be draining out all opponents. And of course, we can double up Dina's effect with things like Marauding Blight Priest. It says whenever you gain life, each opponent loses 1 life. And essentially having multiple copies of our commander in play is never a bad thing. Again, I feel like Dina has not been getting a lot of attention, and she deserves a lot more than she is currently getting. She can make a life gain strategy deadly. And again, like a lot of the other commanders on this list, she can really help you utilize some otherwise useless cards in Commander. But now it's time for us to move on to number 3 with Guillaume, Master Chef. That's right, Magic now has a Chef commander. Guillaume is a 5/3 Troll Warlock with Trample that costs 2 black-green. He has at the beginning of your end step create a number of food tokens equal to the number of non-token creatures you had enter the battlefield under your control this turn. By paying 1, you can sacrifice a food, and target creature gains indestructible until end of turn, tap it. This card has Flavor Win written all over it, and it gives you a unique strategy. This is a chef that cooks meals for your creatures. And then when those creatures eat the meals, they become indestructible. Or you can feed this to your opponent's creatures and potentially give them a stomachache so they're tapped and can't do anything for a while. So yeah, this commander is incredibly unique and lets you build a really fun deck around it. You can utilize the food tokens that it creates in other ways with things like Savvy Hunter. Whenever she attacks or blocks, you get a food token, and you can sacrifice 2 food tokens to draw a card. So now you can use those food tokens for card advantage. You can also utilize some of those food tokens with something like Cauldron Familiar. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. By sacrificing a food, you return from your graveyard to the battlefield. So essentially our commander is always going to be able to prep more food for this hungry cat. And of course we can utilize other recurable creatures like Nether Trader. It says whenever another creature is put into your graveyard from play, you may pay black. If you do, return Nether Trader from your graveyard to play. So if we've got ways to sacrifice other creatures or our creatures just die, we can pay a black and get this back. And again, with it entering the battlefield, our commander is going to prep a meal for us. Or how about a creature that comes back freely like Phytotitan? When it dies, it comes back onto the battlefield tapped under its owner's control at the beginning of their next upkeep. So we either sacrifice this or it dies somehow and we get it back on our upkeep, and then our commander makes us a nice food token. We can also utilize those food tokens with something like Dotha Forge Master. It says tap, sacrifice 3 artifacts, search your library for an artifact card to put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. So this can help us go get something incredibly impactful from our library and get it right into play. Or we can surprise our opponents and take them all out with something like Rampage of the Clans. It says destroy all artifacts and enchantments for each permanent destroyed this way. Its controller creates a 3/3 green centaur creature token. So basically, right before our turn, if we've got a ton of food tokens, we cast this and say goodbye to every food token and everyone's artifacts and enchantments. For everything that was destroyed, its controller gets a 3/3, and yeah, we're probably going to have the most since we've got a ton of food tokens on the board. So this can be a surprise army out of nowhere that can help us really take out our opponents. Again, Guillaume is a fantastically flavorful and unique commander. I really like the design, and I like that you can take food tokens and do something unique with them. But now let's move on to the final runner-up with number 2 with Ozgear the Reconstructor. Ozgear is a 4/4 giant artificer with vigilance that costs 2 red-white. He has pay 1, sacrifice an artifact, target creature you control gets +2/+0 until end of turn. By paying X, you can tap him and exile an artifact card with mana value X from your graveyard, create 2 tokens that are copies of the exiled card, activate only as a sorcery. So Ozgear helps you overutilize artifacts in a very unique way. He can generate you an absurd amount of value throughout the game by turning your artifact set in your graveyard into 2 copies of that artifact in play. So he can ramp you and provide card advantage, and again, this is Boros that we're talking about. Even something as simple as an artifact land like Great Furnace is fantastic in this deck. We get this in play, we tap it for a mana, we sacrifice it with Ozgear. Then we tap Ozgear for 0 to exile this from our graveyard, and we get 2 copies of it in play right away. Ozgear just land ramped us. Again, in Boros. Or how about a mana rock like Soul Ring? We cast it for 1, it taps for 2. We use 1 mana to sacrifice it, and then we use the other mana to tap Ozgear and exile from our graveyard. Now we've got 2 copies of it that are both tapping for 2, so yeah, we just ramped right there as well. We can even utilize a card that has a big downside like Coveted Jewel. When it enters the battlefield, we draw 3 cards and it can tap for 3 mana of any one color. But whenever one or more creatures an opponent controls attack you and aren't blocked, that player draws 3 cards and gains control of Coveted Jewel, untap it. So we get this in play, we draw some cards, we tap for some mana, and if an opponent attacks us and we can't block a creature, we just sacrifice it. Then we can use Ozgear to get 2 copies of it back, and then we draw 6 cards. So we can get a ton of mana out of the 2 copies of it, and if opponents attack us again, we can just sacrifice those things, and our opponents get no Coveted Jewels. Again, it can take something that can provide value, give us even more value, and eliminate downside on certain cards as well. And then how about a card like Mishra's Bauble? It costs 0, and we can tap it to sacrifice and look at the top card of target player's library, draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. So this is essentially a free delayed draw on an artifact. With Ozgear, we can exile this from our graveyard and get 2 copies of it for free, and then draw 2 more. So essentially we're drawing 3 for 0 mana. And of course we want to utilize a card like Magerite Stone. It has pay 1 to tap it to untap target creature that has an activated ability with tap in its cost. And again, with Ozgear, we can get 2 copies of this and make things get out of control even quicker. With all the ramp that this deck can do, we can get a ton of activations out of Ozgear in a turn. And of course, we can utilize some other artifacts with ETBs like Mirror Battlesphere. When it enters the battlefield, you get 4 1/1 Mirror. So if the Battlesphere dies or if we sacrifice it, we can get 2 more copies of it and even more Mirror tokens. And then when we attack with the Battlesphere, we can ping someone for a ton. So yeah, Ozgear takes Boros in a completely different direction, helping it overutilize the graveyard. The amount of value and ramp and card advantage that this can provide is absolutely absurd. So for a Boros commander, that's pretty unheard of and very exciting. But now we've finally gotten to number 1, so it's time for me to reveal the Golden Pig of Strixhaven. And my favorite commander out of all the commanders from Strixhaven and the Precon decks is Awaken the Blood Avatar. Okay, technically, let's get this out of the way first. The front of the card is Extus Orik Overlord. This was our very first MDFC sorcery commander. And although Extus is very unique and can be a very fun build, the backside of the card is definitely what I would focus on. Awaken the Blood Avatar is a sorcery for 6 black-red. It says, as additional cost to cast this spell, you may sacrifice any number of creatures. This spell costs 2 less to cast for each creature sacrificed this way. Each opponent sacrifices a creature, create a 3/6 black and red avatar creature token with haste, and whenever this creature attacks, it deals 3 damage to each opponent. So this is essentially a sorcery that lives in your command zone, and a very powerful and unique one at that. Although this costs 8 mana, it's not going to cost anywhere near that much with a deck built around it. And yes, commander tax does apply to this, but you can just sacrifice more creatures to reduce that cost as well. So essentially you've got a sorcery commander that you can keep just casting for 2 mana with an incredibly powerful effect. It's an edict on all of your opponents, and it gives you a 3/6 that damages your opponents every single time it attacks. Yeah, that's pretty powerful, exciting, and unique. So a deck built around Awaken the Blood avatar can heavily utilize some token creators like Sengir Autocrat, Secure the Waste, and Assemble a Legion. When Sengir Autocrat comes into play, you put 3/0/1 black serf creature tokens onto the battlefield, and when it leaves the battlefield, you exile all serf tokens. Essentially, this is 4 creatures for 4 mana. And again, that's essentially up to 8 cost reduction for our commander. And then Secure the Waste says put X/1/1 white warrior creature tokens onto the battlefield. So again, for each mana that we put into X, we're essentially saving mana in the long run, because each of those creature tokens that we make is essentially a 2 cost reduction for our commander. And then Assemble a Legion is absolutely absurd with this commander. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, put a muster counter on Assemble a Legion. Then put a 1/1 red and white soldier creature token with haste onto the battlefield for each muster counter on it. So this is a token creator that makes us more and more tokens as the game progresses. So this can really help us keep up with all the commander tax that we're going to be accruing. But our opponents can actually help us out with that as well with things like Mob Rule. It says choose 1, gain control of all creatures with power 4 or greater until end of turn, untap those creatures that gain haste until end of turn. Or essentially we can gain control of all creatures with power 3 or less and do the same. So essentially we can gain control of a ton of creatures, swing with them, and then sacrifice them for our commander to make our opponent sacrifice even more creatures. And speaking of our opponent sacrificing creatures, we can get even more creatures out of that with something like Ogre Slumlord. It says whenever another non-token creature dies, you may create a 1/1 black rat creature token. So when anyone has a non-token creature dying, including ourselves and our opponents, we're going to be getting more creature tokens. So by sacrificing non-token creatures to our commander and by forcing our opponents to sacrifice creatures as well, we can get a ton of tokens to cast our commander even more. And speaking of casting our commander even more, there's Fury Storm. It says whenever you cast a spell, copy it for each time you've cast your commander from the command zone this game. You may choose new targets for the copies. Copy target instant or sorcery spell, you may choose new targets for the copy. Essentially, for every single time that we've cast Awaken the Blood Avatar, we're getting more copies of Fury Storm. And then we make a ton of copies of Awaken the Blood Avatar, which makes our opponent sacrifice a ton of creatures, and then gives us a lot of those 3/6s that ping them when they attack. So yeah, our opponents won't be lasting very long when we do that. Now, of course, there are a lot of other exciting things that you can do with this commander, and these are just some of them. But as this was the very first MDFC sorcery commander that was spoiled, this one I think knocked it out of the park. This commander has a ton of potential and can do a lot of unique and exciting things. And a lot of very powerful things that can wipe out your opponents in absolutely no time. So Awaken the Blood Avatar, make sure you're on the lookout for that Golden Pig trophy in the mail. But again, a huge thank you to all the commanders out there that competed for this prestigious award. Unfortunately, there can be only one Golden Pig of Strixhaven. But luckily, or perhaps unluckily for all those commanders that were not mentioned in this episode, there is still one more award that is up for grabs. So make sure on the lookout for the next award ceremony with the Golden Toilet of Strixhaven. Who will win this other prestigious award? Tune in to find out. But until then, as always, thanks again and have a good one.